Here's a video put together out of another 10 VYou shorts, VYou being the now defunct social network that used video responses, which had to be 2 minutes or less, to comments and questions, and users could write to each other or people could ask questions from the outside. And I've been compiling these into videos. Now I have another 10 more that have to do with ethics, but these have to do with what we might call issues at the intersection between ethics and politics or culture, where we're talking about a larger context. So hopefully you'll enjoy these, and maybe they'll provoke some thought, some conversation, some questions, some comments.
Well, this is one which was posted a few days ago that I have been kind of putting in the backlog as I think more and more about it. How would I define justice? I don't have my own definition. I'm content to rely on those of philosophers of the past. And one of the most common ways of framing it that you see come up is giving people what is their due, giving everybody what is their due, what ought to be given to them, rendering onto them what ought to be. Now, here's the thing. When it comes down to it, basically, I'm an Aristotelian when it comes to justice. And that means that I don't think that there is one single catch-all, cover-everything definition of justice. I think that there are different species of justice, and Aristotle talks about different types of justice in his different works. I think that a lot of our disputes about justice are exactly as Aristotle says. The different sides of the dispute, some of them get this aspect, some of them get this aspect. They don't actually grasp the whole, and they think that they're grasping the whole, which is why they get so worked up and dismiss their interlocutors and get things mixed up a bit. I think that justice is what you can call an analogical term, that it covers a whole family of concepts. And I think that there can be developments to it, additions to it over time, so that, for example, the notion of social justice, I don't like people who say that they're all about social justice, because social justice is just one type of justice. It's got to fit within the matrix of it. So if they're using it to try to bash everything else, that's no good. But are there developments over time, new things that we didn't catch? Yes.
So when we were studying Book 1 of the Republic, this is a big worry for quite a few of my students. They saw this guy Thrasymachus back in 4th century Greece saying, hey, justice and injustice are basically in the eye not of the beholder per se, but in the eye of the rich and the powerful, the people who get to make the rules. And they said, well, it looks an awful lot like that today. If you look at the marketplace, or you look at politics, or you look at celebrities and popular culture, it does seem an awful lot like those who are able to push their agenda onto other people, who have the means to do so, who have force or money or votes, or however you want to put it, charisma, just ruthlessness. Those are the people who actually succeed, and those are the people who get to call the shots. This worries my students an awful lot, but that's not a new thing. That's been a perennial issue throughout the ages, all the way going back to the ancient Greeks. The fact that quite often it does work that way shouldn't be mistaken for something quite different, which is saying that it should work that way, or that one should just sort of buckle under and say, oh, okay, you got power, I'm going to do what you want. Who do we look up to? This is one thing you ought to think about. Do we look up to those who just see how things are and then accommodate themselves to it, or do we look up to those who actually take a moral stand and say, yeah, in this case, this isn't right. Maybe this authority is legitimate, but this authority isn't, and they're doing the wrong thing, so I'm actually going to say something about it, or I'm going to do something about it. We look up to those people, don't we? So that shows you that Thrasymachus doesn't actually. Now, this is a worry raised by one of my students in my online ethics class. Why should we, everyday people, ordinary people, right, allow authorities to decide what is right or wrong or good and bad? Why do we let it happen? So there's a lot of different questions rolled up in that. And you've got your finger on sort of the knot of a lot of different issues that are worth exploring. And I might actually talk about this in a Dr. Sadler Chalk and Talk. There's one pretty simple answer to this, which is that ordinary people shouldn't allow authorities right across the board to decide what's right and wrong or good and bad, that they actually should do some thinking for themselves. Now that doesn't mean that we get rid of authority altogether and we say, authority figure, I'm not going to listen to you, period. Because there may be some cases where the authority is in fact the person who has to make the final decision, or where they're better qualified to make the decision, in part because of their training or their experience, or the reason why they're made into an authority. But simply having authority doesn't necessarily confer upon one anything like moral infallibility, or even a greater degree of reliability than an ordinary person. Now you can say, should we allow authorities in some cases to decide what's right and wrong or good and bad? And I think, yeah, in some cases we should. Now notice, can we leave which cases should be those in which we do that and which cases shouldn't be? Can we leave that decision up to authorities? That's at a higher level, right? That's probably a bad idea, because what do authorities typically do? They'll tend to assimilate everything to themselves and say, of course, I'm ready to decide all of this stuff. So we should probably
When I first read this question, I thought to myself, the person must be mixing up Iraq and Afghanistan, because a lot of people have said that we went to war with Iraq in terms of oil. And that actually was true of the first Gulf War to a larger extent. If we'd gone in terms of oil, we'd have been taking that oil, which we didn't. And there were other reasons we went into Iraq. There were 3 reasons in the argument for it. Afghanistan, we went over there in part because the Taliban were refusing to give up Osama bin Laden and the other members of Al-Qaeda after the 9/11 bombing. When I thought about this, I thought, boy, who doesn't know that? But our students, who are college students now, that happened when they were kids. So I could see how they might not know that. That's definitely something that we're going to have to keep in mind as the years go by. Okay, so you have 2 very interesting questions here, and I think that I am going to have to put off the full discussion of these to Dr. Sadler Chalk and Talk sessions. I'll give you a real quick response to both. Is America and other countries' quest to democratize other countries unreasonable? Well, that's an interesting thing. If we go all the way back to the Peloponnesian War, in which you've got this conflict between democracy and oligarchy or aristocracy, depending on how you want to look at it, one of the tendencies of democracy is to try to spread itself as a system. But one of the problems with spreading democracy is if the people over there that you're now introducing a democracy to don't see eye to eye to you on basic values, the majority of them may decide they want to kill you. And democratic regimes are not necessarily the most stable regimes available. In the modern era, they've become so. But, there's a big debate still going on about that, because some totalitarian regimes seem to have some real longevity as well. There was something called the democracy agenda, and that's part of how we got into some of the adventures that we've been involved in. And this idea was, well, we would bring democracy to the Middle East, and that's going to, diffuse a lot of these sort of tensions that are growing and festering in places where it's authoritarian rule. Will religion in other countries allow for this? Yes and no. It depends on the interpretation of the religion, and where it's really a fundamental issue is with Islam. Is Islam compatible with democracy? And that's an open. Well, that's an interesting question, and that's something that has been done actually in some wars. And actually there's been some movies made about that, but the problem is people who've committed heinous crimes usually don't make very good soldiers at all. They tend to be too self-centered, and they're not usually very good in their units. So I would say no. We probably shouldn't send people who've been charged with heinous crimes. Actually, we shouldn't do anything with people who've been charged, right? You want to see if they're actually guilty or not. But no, I don't think we should send them overseas. Our military, there's reasons why they don't take those kind of guys. So. What are my thoughts on France's Burka ban? I think that, very simply put, it is a sign of a crisis. That France and Europe in general has failed on a very fundamental level intellectually to figure out how they're going to deal with religion, which is not going to go away, and how to deal with the connection between religion and ethnicity and modernity. And if this is the best that they can produce as a way of trying to promote enculturation and and assimilation of religious minorities in France, it's really quite shameful. Now, I'm no advocate of radical Islam, but you have to understand that there's many people within Islam that are very traditionalist that are not radicalized. And France, like many of the other European countries, has done a terrible job in bringing them in and talking about religion, in part because they did a terrible job with Christianity. If you look at the French history going all the way back to the Revolution and then through the Third Republic, they were so hostile to religion and so triumphalistic in their hemming it in that they set a very bad precedent for thinking through these sorts of things. Secularization does not necessarily mean religion has to go completely away. Having a modern democratic society does not mean that people have to abandon their religious identity or marks of it. But it's turning out to be like that in Europe. So there's a real crisis there. Yeah, I disagree. Making allowances for religion would be a huge step backward for society. I'm sure it would be in some people's eyes. And the French model, and for the large part the European model of secularization, you're right, but that's not the only model. I actually do think we have a better model here in America, and actually so did Alexis de Tocqueville, a famous Frenchman who wrote about this in the 19th century. We went through something very similar to this need to show their faces to identify themselves business with some Saudi women who were, veiled from head to toe, and we had to take care of that for passports and for driver's licenses. And there are workarounds for that. What we're talking about in France is not just being able to identify people on photos. You're talking about a ban altogether. And this is part of a larger process which has tried to outlaw any sort of, religious emblems or marks of identity. it just shows a hostility to religion and a lack of understanding of the importance of religious identity to many people. And that's going back in France a long ways. I mean, the era that I do research on, the Catholic philosophers were excluded from the philosophical establishment. One of the guys that I work on, Maurice Blondel, after publishing his dissertation, he was forbidden to teach for 2 years because he was Catholic and his dissertation touched on that. They kicked the religious orders out, in the early 1900s. France has got a long history of this sort of thing. So I don't buy the it's just a matter of identifying yourself sort of line. This is a symptom of a larger problem. There's a lot of good things about France. This isn't one of them. So what I assume that you're talking about would be showing or releasing a photo of Osama bin Laden's corpse, right? Because they've been showing photos of him all day long. Some of the stock photos that we've had before of him in the camouflage with the turban or standing, very tall next to other people. Would it be a wise decision to release a photo of his body in order to prove his death, or will this cause more problems? Good question. I think that as far as ordinary people go, you probably don't need it. And as far as radical Islamicists, or as I prefer the term, totalitarian Islamicists go, I don't think that you have to convince them either that we've actually killed him, because first off, he's been sort of out of the loop in a lot of circles for quite a while, and second, rhetorically, it affords them a chance to have another high-profile martyr. I guess the people that it would be a matter of reaching would be the nascent conspiracy theorists, right? And it wouldn't matter if you showed them a photo, because then they would have all sorts of responses like the photo is doctored, or that's not really him, or any variety of different things to dismiss it. So I don't think that it would actually be helpful to provide any photo. I think it wasn't smart to do the burial at sea, because they should have known that would provoke all sorts of questions. But what's done is done, and the same thing would have come up if we said, well, his body was blown to bits by a munition or something like that. So that's my take.
Well, the obvious knee-jerk answer, a professor, an academic, somebody who makes use of libraries as much as I do, ought to be, no, we should never, ever, 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 ever ban books. But that's not what I actually think. I think that there is some legitimate purposes for banning certain books. I also think that something that's very important to clarify from the start is the difference between banning books and, in the sense of actually saying, you cannot have this book cannot be located in this building, you can't check it out from here, those sorts of things. A distinction needs to be made between that and saying, look, we're not going to purchase this book. We have X amount of dollars. There's a lot of different things we could purchase. There's always more things, many, many, many more things available for libraries than they're able to purchase. So, placing something lower down in the scale of preferability or something like that, or even saying, look, so long as conditions are what they are, we're not going to buy this book. I don't see that as exactly the same thing as banning books. Even if the motive of the person is to say, look, we would never buy this book, if a decision is being made about where to allocate resources, that's not quite the same as banning. Should there be a rating system? That would be kind of nice, but I see all sorts of difficulties in putting together the nuts and bolts of a rating system like that. But something like that could be useful for libraries. It's all fairly loosey-goosey right now, isn't it? a lot of subjective decisions being made. So there's my take as somebody who uses an awful lot of libraries.